Today, I had, there was an appointment that was supposed to come, and there was our guys that were part of our internet were supposed to go out and fix the power lines that were damaged from our tree that fell on top of the power line from the storm that happened last week. So they were going to show up twice now, and it's the second time that they said they were going to come and they were going to show up at such and such time, but they didn't show up. And so I point that out to say that in my life, behind the scenes, outside of this class, I've experienced people, saying they're going to do one thing, but then they do something opposite, and they don't keep their word. They fall back on their word. And I've experienced that time and time in my life where people break their promises. They don't keep their word. Also, and it's not to say everybody in my life has been that way, but I know that there's been some people who have been unfaithful. And to be honest, I was just thinking about this before I came back up here. And I asked God forgiveness in ways that I've been unfaithful to Him and not kept my word. I'm sure that maybe in your own life as NBC students, outside of the walls of this classroom, maybe even within the classroom, and that's between you and God, you have experienced that as well, where people have broken their word, where people have been unfaithful and hurt you in some type of way. But yet God has an answer to this issue and this struggle. Because sometimes we ask ourselves in the midst of this, where's the hope in this? Where is God's, who is going to be faithful? And God answers that question in Genesis 9, where He shows us that He is the one that always keeps His word. He is the one that is always faithful. So, turn to, if you have Bibles, phones, whatever, Genesis 9. We're going to skip a little bit because there's a lot to read here. 8 through 11, 14 to 16. Okay, we're all there. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, "As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal on the earth with you, as many came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth." When I bring clouds over the earth, and the bow is seen in the cloud, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you, and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the cloud, I will see it, and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all the flesh that is on the earth. So, I think we need to kind of understand the context of what's going on in this scripture. Before this chapter, you have chapter 1 through 8. And in a synopsis, the Genesis story is God creates man, but man rebels in the garden. Man increases on the earth by God's command to increase, but sin increases. And sin gets so bad in time of the Noah. I mean, guys probably remember some of this story, that God is grieved. He's broken in his heart over what mankind is doing with his great earth and with each other. They're sinning against him. They're breaking their word. They're being unfaithful to him. And Noah's not even better. Even though Noah was faithful to build the ark, after the event, after the flood, he gets drunk. And so you have all these issues where humans are being unfaithful, being sinful, but yet God is still in the middle of saying, this is my word. I know what's going on. I know that you guys keep breaking your word, but I will remain faithful to what we call the Noahic covenant. And it's not dependent on our faithfulness. It's not dependent on what we do or what we don't do, because this promise is for all future generations. It's not dependent on Noah. It's not dependent on what the animals do. It's not dependent on that. And we know this because in the chapter before that, in verse 8, chapter 8, 21, it says in verse 21 of chapter 8, the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every implication of the human heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all living flesh as I have done. So this is communicating that God is faithful to never destroy the earth again in this way. Doesn't mean he won't do it again, but he will in this way with the flood. We can know this by the fact that he put the rainbow in the sky. Whenever you see a rainbow, that's a reminder that God keeps his promise. Another way to communicate this even more is the fact that in Hebrew, the word rainbow is communicated just as a bow. In other words, it's the same word we get for a weapon. So the idea is, that analogy here is to communicate again what we're talking about, God's faithfulness. His faithfulness to show mercy, his faithfulness to keep his covenant, to be peaceful and never flood the earth again. What he does is kind of like, the image is like God had the bow and he was aiming at human over their sin and grieved with his heart, but he was punishing them this way. And then he puts the rainbow, the bow up into the sky and said, I'm not going to do this again. I'm done. I put my weapon up. I'm done. And that's what it's trying to communicate, that God's not going to do that this way. In the chapel service by Dr. Church, he kind of communicates that same thing. But the point is here, God is keeping his promise. He's saying, I put my weapon up. I will show mercy in this way. I will show peace in this way. I will not do this again. In spite of whatever man does, God still remains faithful. So, you might ask, what does this have to do with us? I mean, how do you apply this to your life if we don't have any part in this covenant? And then some may struggle. Sometimes when you turn on the news or you just see the way the human race can be at times, you see nothing but unfaithfulness. People are not faithful. But in spite of that, we're struggling with that. And then maybe others may struggle with kind of the sign of the rainbow and maybe think, well, maybe that's more promoting love wins or some type of different, more modern translation of what people might think the rainbow means. Now, I respect those questions. I respect some of those thinking. But at the same time, God's bow stays the same. It'll always remain the same, that he is a God of mercy, that he's a God of peace. And the way it can apply to our lives is that we can, because what he does in this text, he mentions to Noah a couple of times He repeats himself. And it's like a reminder to Noah. It's like letting him know that he can put his hope in spite of what just happened. The fact that God put a bunch of water on the earth and judged the world in this way, that Noah can have hope that God will keep his promise, that God remains faithful in spite of the unfaithfulness of man. And that gives us hope. We can know this, that God is faithful. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot disown himself. That is Paul in 2 Timothy 2:13. So now what? What do we do with this? Now that we know that God is faithful to keep his promise to never flood the earth again, basically, next time we see we see a rainbow up in the sky. We're driving around. I've seen a couple rainbows here in Colorado, and it's pretty awesome rainbows. Double rainbows, man. What does it mean? So you see these rainbows, and every time we can see that rainbow, let it have faith in your heart that you can remember and know that God is faithful. God keeps his word. He doesn't break his word like humans can do. And I'm not to say humans can't keep the word, but that's a good reminder as we see unfaithfulness in this world. And that's regardless if you're a believer or non-believer. I would hope that if you're a non-believer that you may see the rainbow and believe the same thing, but you may not. And regardless of you believe that God is a covenant keeper or not, God is still faithful. Another way is we can read this text, open up the Bible, and just read it again and remember who God is, that he's faithful. It's just reminding ourselves, in spite of everything, that God is faithful. In fact, we can remember that he's faithful not just to us, but he's also faithful to all creatures, to all animals. Even my dog. He's faithful even to my dog. He's faithful to all of us. Before I got here, I was actually preaching to my dog. Practice as Professor Joe Warrington recommended me to do. So, again, we go back where we started, behind the scenes, outside of NBC. Some of the stuff we see on news, some of the stuff that we encounter with friends or family or whatever your experience with, people breaking their word, people being unfaithful, people hurting our feelings. As we just talked about a sermon where how ugly people can be sometimes. But God still remains faithful. God is the one that we can believe to keep his promise. But more closer to home, to actually personally what I've went through recently, I think I'm really hoping this illustration I just a couple days ago or so, I was at a gas station. There was this guy who was having problems filling up his tank. And he didn't have money for gas. And I've heard this kind of story before. But something inside of me led me to help out this gentleman and help fill his tank up. And he was explaining to me his family life story and the fact that, because I asked him if he needed prayer, and he was telling me all this about how his wife was lying to him and being unfaithful in that, about probably finances. His daughter was misusing his car and kind of running out the gas. And I don't know if all this was true, and I'll never see this gentleman again. But what I know is, it was like God was giving me this illustration, it felt like. And yet, in spite of that, God still empowered me to reach out to this gentleman and fill his gas. And we were both praying, and I was hearing all this, and I was thinking, I was being reminded, we both were being reminded, that God is faithful. in spite of what was going on with his family. And with this gentleman, it's kind of like this. God fills our tanks. It's like well, I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but it's like, this is God's part in this to Noah. But that man didn't have to do anything. I mean, I'm using this story to say that man didn't have to do anything. I didn't ask him to pay me back, or hey, you better give me some candy bar while you're at it, you know. I just didn't expect anything from him. And that's the same thing with this story. In spite of what man has done, or in spite of what we stupidly do, God is still faithful. God is still doing his part in spite of the fact the way we can be or others can be. And so I didn't expect anything from that man. And the same thing with this story. God doesn't expect anything from Noah. I gave you guys, I think I'm trying to be funny here, but there's sticky statements on sticky notes. And this is the thing I want you to bring with you during the week and continually. God is faithful to keep his promise. I will know and hope in this. And maybe that might inspire faithfulness in you as you embrace that. But I think the whole point of the text is just to know that God is faithful, to have hope in that.